Shabbat Shalom. As you know, in order to be a rabbi in America in the 21st century, or maybe just a rabbi in general, you need not only be an expert in theology, but an expert in history as well. And so I'll put you through a little quiz. For example, do you know why so much of European history is referred to as the Dark Ages? Because there were so many nights. It's true. Do you know what the Pilgrims' favorite kind of music was? Plymouth Rock. And perhaps you know how the Roman Empire came to an end. It was as a result of a pair of Caesars. No? Shabbat Shalom. History has been on my mind lately as we watch so much of what has been going on around our country and around the world. What feels like efforts to rewrite history, which really are efforts to rewrite memory. And while I like to joke, what we're watching in our own day and age is not a laughing matter. We Jews know about attempts to rewrite memory. People have been attempting to rewrite memory to ignore aspects of history as it pertains to the Holocaust for decades. People have been doing the same for the state of Israel for so many years. And now, as Americans, we're watching assaults from both the left and the right on the history of this country, particularly as it pertains to slavery, and how that, as a result, then leads to what we talked about a couple weeks ago with regard to Maus. Because if you can't read anything bad about history, guess what? You're going to miss a few parts. And we're also watching this incredible attack, this assault on history and on memory with regard to what happened on January 6th, just over a year ago. We're watching it take place before our very eyes, how history is being rewritten and our memories altered because people are trying to corrupt, to mislead, to use history for their own purposes. But that is often what happens to history. Because what we recognize day in and day out and often call history is not actually history, but memory. What we see in history books, what the authors of those books choose to put in, choose to leave out, choose to emphasize or de-emphasize, is a function not of history so much, but is a function of memory. And so with that in mind, I want to invite you to think about this morning's Torah portion, Parashat Ki Tissa. We know the central story of this week's Torah portion is the incident of the golden calf. And we know this story pretty well. Moses was up on a mountain for 40 days. Our ancestors got tired of waiting for him. So some of them called forward, and Aaron said, collect all of the gold and all of the silver. And they took it and they molded it into a golden calf, and they said, this is your God, Israel. This is your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This was 40 days since the giving of the Ten Commandments. This was a few months since the sea parted and our ancestors walked through on dry land. This is a few months since the end of slavery and coming out to freedom. How quickly they forgot. And so what was going on there? I just gave you the history. Moses comes down from the mountain. We know that he holds up 3 tablets and says, the Lord has given you these 10 commandments for all to obey. If you don't know it, it's a reference to history of the world. It's your homework. You watch it after Shabbos. Mel Brooks talk about memory and not history. Right? But Moses comes down, shatters the tablets. The Levites come up and they slaughter 3,000 followers of idolatry. And that's the history of the golden calf. But what is the story that we choose to remember? What is our memory of it? As Steve read beautifully in our Torah portion, we focus on the forgiveness. God is ready to wipe out our ancestors. Moses intervenes. And as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory beautifully teaches, God says, I'm going to destroy these people because they're a stiff-necked people. And Moses rebuts and stands up in our defense and says, God, you can't destroy them because they're a stiff-necked people. You know all that they're going to go through, God. You know that they need to be stiff-necked just to survive that. So God relents and God forgives. That's why on the holidays, we read actually from this section during our Torah service, because on purpose chants, the Lord, compassionate, quick to forgive, because that's in our Torah portion this week. Part of what we choose to remember about this story and the golden calf is how God forgives us. Part of what we choose to remember about this story is a question of leadership. Our rabbis read Aaron not as an accomplice in the golden calf, but they say, look how Aaron stepped forward to try to delay this rebellion as long as possible, to give Moses time to come down from the mountain, because Aaron says, okay, let's have a festival to God tomorrow, hoping for at least another 24 hours to let Moses come down from the mountain. Our rabbis have in a lot of ways changed our memory to understand Aaron in a different way. This is the golden calf. Our rabbis also rewrite the Sefer Torah a little bit, because we've spent the last few weeks reading about the Mishkan, reading about the tabernacle, that portable sanctuary in the wilderness, and now we come to the golden calf. But our rabbis teach, Ein mukdam ve'ein mu'achar b'Torah, there's no early and late in the Torah. So they invert the parshiot and say what happens first is the incident of the golden calf. And because our ancestors had lost faith so quickly in an invisible God, they therefore needed a visible reminder of God's presence. And so first you have the golden calf, and then you have the commandments to build that sanctuary in the wilderness. Our rabbis helped change our memory a little bit, to remember that because sometimes we lose faith in that invisible God, we need a place to which we can come in order to remind ourselves of God's presence in our lives. There's history, and there's memory. And I might suggest, as we look at the history of the Jewish people, or perhaps it's the memory of the Jewish people, that what we've come to learn is that establishing a physical structure is a part of how we remember, but it's not only how we remember. Because as we well know, the tabernacle became part of the first holy temple, which was destroyed. And then there was a second holy temple, which was destroyed. But never did we forget what happened when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt to freedom. How could it be that if God says in response to the golden calf, we're going to build something visible, and then that gets destroyed, we still remember? And I think the answer to that question is ritual. Because we don't just build, we do. How is it that we remember year after year that God brought us out of slavery into freedom? And I think the answer is very clear. We sit around a table a couple nights each year, and we tell that story. We eat food that symbolizes that day. We smell. We taste. We do. We sing. And through all of these different methods, through all of these different rituals, we come to remember. In just a few weeks' time, we're going to celebrate Purim. What is the story of Purim? We know the history. What is the story? The story is one of the Jewish people not waiting for God to directly get involved, but the Jewish people in diaspora who stood up for themselves and overthrew the threats against them. That's our memory of Purim. We didn't just build an edifice to remember that. What did we do? We have costume contests. We sing, we dance, we drink, and we read the story each and every year. And these rituals help us to remember our memory, how we stood up for ourselves, how God was hidden in those days and not overt, how God was Hester, secret, like the name Esther. And that's how we overcame our enemies in the diaspora. We can say the same thing about the holiday of Sukkot. Why do we remember Sukkot? Because for a week out of every year, we build these crazy huts in the middle of our suburban backyards. And we invite our company over. And we serve etrog liqueur. Maybe that's only at my house. Right? And we remember. We remember the story of Sukkot. We build and we perform rituals. Which brings us to our own day and age. We know that we have an obligation to remember the Holocaust, but I'm not sure we know exactly what that means yet. What is the story about the Holocaust? What is the memory of the Holocaust that we need to put forward? Is it the memory of what happens when secular people have too much power and try to destroy? Is it the memory of what happens when those who discriminate have government tools at their disposal? Is it the memory of how Jews, time and again, are able to fight back in ways small and large against our enemies? Is it what happens when people are silent? Is the story of the Holocaust about what happens when good people are mostly silent? Reminds me, Saul Ruby taught beautifully at our 9 a.m. timely Torah session this morning, that if we think about the incident of the golden calf, there were probably only a small fraction of people who actually put their gold and their silver toward the construction of that calf. A small number of people who actually participated in the worship of the golden calf, and millions who just sat by and did nothing. Maybe that's the story of the golden calf, just like it's the story of the Holocaust. Or maybe the story of the Holocaust is that this is what happens when the Jewish people don't have a state and an army to stand up for them. That's also a story of the Holocaust. How do we remember the Holocaust? It's got to be more than a yahrzeit candle, because that's not doing it. Look around the world. Lighting a yahrzeit candle once a year is not doing it. That's not helping us remember what happened in the Holocaust. That's not helping us to prevent it from happening again. We have to do more. I invite you to join me in that conversation. I'm looking to the Shalom Hartman Institute because they are asking that very question with regard to the Holocaust. How do we remember? And there happens to be a very brilliant and beautiful bride working on that project. We're going to try to do that, participate with them in a few months, and ask the question, what does it mean to remember the Holocaust? What does it mean to remember the birth of the state of Israel? How do we tell that story? There are two significant narratives with the birth of the state of Israel. One, we were vulnerable, and therefore we need a state. No one else will stand up for the Jews, and therefore we Jews need to stand up for ourselves. That's one of the stories of the birth of the state of Israel. But there's another story about the birth of the state of Israel that has nothing to do with our vulnerability and our weakness, and has everything to do with our obligation, as we read in Isaiah, to be a light unto the nations, that when we have power, we have the obligation to do good things for all people, to be a model nation to the rest of the world. That's another story about the birth of the state of Israel. It's meant to be the ideal nation. How do we teach that story too? How to remember that memory? Through building and through ritual. And it's got to be more than just singing a few songs once a year on Yom Ha'atzmaut. It has to be more. What are we going to do? And as we think about the assault on American history, whether it's from hundreds of years ago and our desire to deal with this issue of slavery, or perhaps to ignore the issue of slavery, whether it's our desire to deal with what happened a year ago on January 6th, or to rewrite that memory, what are we going to do to make sure that the right stories are carried forward from generation to generation? I certainly don't have all the answers, but I invite you to participate with me in this conversation. What buildings need to be built? What statues need to be erected in order to remember, just as the tabernacle was built in response to the golden calf? And I might ask too, perhaps even more important than that, what rituals do we need to begin year after year so that our history, and even more importantly, our memory, remains intact, just like they do at Passover, just like they do at Sukkot, just like they do at Purim a few weeks from now? I invite you to join me in this conversation and in this wrestling. Adonai oz le'amo yitein, Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. May God grant us the strength to remember even the difficult parts of history. May God bless us with the peace that comes from knowing that we're carrying forward the important memory year after year. And let us say together, Amen and Shabbat Shalom. Our service continues now.